Hi all, I'm a Clockwise Squirrel, and welcome to Ground Up History. At this time, a channel dedicated almost entirely to mud and insects. So that title carries a bit of a contentious thesis, eh? I mean, maybe you were clicking and you thought, yeah, I guess, crops are pretty important. Or maybe you were clicking in a near catatonic state and didn't really have time to think about the implication before you started watching the video. Whatever the case may be, welcome, get comfy, and prepare to be inundated by a wave of information from a man who doesn't know how to monetize my entire degree. So let's do a little bit of biology so that we can establish what we're actually talking about with this animal. Now, when we think of bees, we probably think of honeybees, which make up our domesticated species. And like any other domesticated species, there can be a wide variety of different temperaments and productivity levels depending on what's needed and where. As a result, bees have been introduced in many subcategories to many different places on the planet dependent on those needs. For example, here in Canada, one of the more popular subtypes is called the Carniolan. Carniolan? I don't really know how to pronounce it, but basically it's a gentle little bumblebee that has a good temperament and generally is resistant to winters, so it's kind of ideally suited to needs here. Look at these beautiful girls. And by the way, Bee Movie lied to you, worker bees are females. By comparison, the Africanized or killer bee is really productive and resistant to most diseases, but, as the name implies, is highly aggressive and doesn't like winter. So, depending on what you want, you might want a killer bee, but probably not in Canada. That's what we in the biz call domestication. There are many different subcategories all over the world, and they're basically all designed to do different stuff depending on what's needed locally. But of course, most species of bees aren't actually domesticated. In fact, there's over 20,000 known wild species of bees out there. Right now, every continent on Earth, except for Antarctica that we know of, has some form of wild native species of bee. And most of these aren't actually honeybees. Honeybees are generally actually an export from Europe. But these wild pollinators can actually, in certain cases, be way better than domesticated pollinators. Like, for example, many crops that don't actually require insect pollination, studies have shown are actually more quality and quantity productive when exposed to wild native bee species. This is especially true when those wild bees are interacting with crops that they evolved along with in the same ecosystem. Who would have thunk, eh? So if these wild insect pollinators are so important, why don't we necessarily see them? Or why do we only think of honeybees? Well, wild bees come in all shapes and sizes. Some can actually be as small as 2 millimeters long. And for my Americans out there, that's about the size of a football field divided by an Olympic skating rink. But despite that minuscule size, they have a truly staggering impact. It's estimated that 80% of all flowering plants on the planet are pollinated by insect pollinators, of which bees are far and away the largest number of. So now that we've established all that, let's move into a little bit of history and talk about why I would have picked such a contentious title. And you probably have an idea right now as to where I'm going with this, right? You think of the foundations of civilization and you think, okay, guys were wandering along, they found a river, some tasty grass. Next thing you know, they're building pyramids and forming complicated socioeconomic structures. And that's not actually really where I'm going with this, because a lot of that early agriculture was farming grasses. And those grasses are wind pollinated, not insect pollinated. All those major staples that you're probably thinking of, rice, wheat, corn, sorghum, it's all wind pollinated. So, I mean, look at me, the fool, suggesting that maybe the foundation of civilization has more to do with than just grass. It's just bees. But okay, I can hear you screaming at your screen, why then would civilization be dependent on bees? Well, here's the thing. For most of time, humans weren't agrarians, we were gatherers. And as gatherers, we depended on flowering plants that produce fruits and vegetables, of which we just established 80% are dependent on insect pollinators. In some environments, even more than that. So if human gatherers are dependent on the crops that are pollinated by bees, or the animals that we hunt are, we're kind of dependent on those bees doing all right. And even in those early agrarian civilizations, like, say, ancient Egypt, ancient Mesopotamia, they would still gather from their local ecosystem. It's not like they just started farming and that was a hard cutoff where it's like, we don't like deer anymore, I'll never touch an apple again. So the first civilizations in river valleys appeared about in 3200 BCE in Mesopotamia, what's roughly modern-day Iraq. And those civilizations started to appear in pretty recognizable patterns. The reason we say 3200 BC is the start is because that's where we first started seeing places appear with populations into the tens of thousands for cities. So while we may have been farming for longer than that, that's roughly when cities at least started. And no matter where you are, whether it be Asia, the Middle East, Central America, it basically would go by the same pattern. You'd find a fertile river valley, you'd start planting some tasty crops there, it would be more productive, you could have specialization, then you start getting priests and landlords, whole complicated socioeconomic structures. And we have a continuity of information from that period that we can still actually translate to this day. There's a wealth of material history in the form of writing and even coinage. And yeah, Hammurabi's takes aren't the best, but the fact that we can read his law still to this day is kind of astounding. And, you know, you can't really blame the guy for his takes. He existed before Twitter. How could he know he was morally wrong? But here's the thing. Humans evolved a lot longer ago than 3200 BCE. We've been around for 300,000 years. Even if you only want to go by our more modern physiology, it's 160,000 years that Homo sapiens have been wandering this planet. Over the whole stretch of that time, we were exploring the world, learning new things, developing languages, developing cultures, making art. And yeah, sure, when we coalesce into what we think of civilizations, we think of larger societies. But even contemporaneous to those river valley civilizations, there were large civilizations and language groups that had culture, had buildings, had systems of commerce. They were just nomadic or semi-nomadic, or they built with things that we can't find anymore. And even if you want to say that to be considered civilization, there has to be buildings, that still pushes our timeline back a lot farther than 3200 BCE. The first building sites are 12,000 years old. And yeah, my math isn't the best. I basically just use it now for D&D rolls. It seems like 12,000 years ago was a lot longer than 5,200 years ago. So for tens of thousands of years, humans were wandering the planet, carving sticks into pointy things that we used to kill antelopes, having parties, dancing around fires, all that good human stuff. And over that time, we didn't just dominate nature. We came into complicated ecosystems and had to mold ourselves to succeed there. We had to fashion tools, clothing, discover what was safe to eat. And in all of those ecosystems, or at least many of them, we found ourselves fed by bees. The bountiful crops of the forest that sustained us were predominantly being pollinated by those tiny little humble bumbles. And in that early first steps we took out into the world, we had millennia of learning and knowledge building that allowed us to eventually succeed. I mean, think of how many humans had to die so that we know which mushrooms are poisonous, or how hot we should be cooking certain meats, or, God, just to get domesticated animals. I mean, I wouldn't want to try to domesticate a cow. I know dogs and cats mostly domesticated themselves, but where they're not fluffy, they are sharp. So we truly stand on untold millions of dead over-curious apes. And even those early river valley civilizations didn't really decouple from nature. I mean, all it takes is one bad harvest to completely destroy a city-state, right? So it's important to contextualize just how intertwined we were and still are with the environments we find ourselves in. Okay, but I can already hear you whining into the screen. So what if we wandered for 10,000 years? That's not civilization. And okay, you've convinced me. Yeah, sure, that's very reductionist and maybe a little bit Eurocentric of you, dear viewer, but you're right. I should actually use a historical societal example of where bees were so important to us. So I take you now to the First Nations of North and Central America and the Three Sisters. Of course, trust the North American to start there. And if you're not familiar with the term Three Sisters, it's basically a term for three crops that were planted together: maize, beans, and squash. And if you're not familiar with the term First Nations, here's what you can do to understand why I used it. Go to any Central or South American and ask them how annoying it is that the term American is used for basically just people from the US, and then apply that same logic to the term Native American, and congrats, now you understand Canada. But back to crops. So basically, these three crops were planted together in what's known as companion planting. Basically, exactly what it sounds like. The maize would be planted in a small dirt mound, and it would act as a trestle for the beans, which would add nitrogen to the soil, all of which would be covered and kept moist by these large squash leaves that would help beat off the sun. So all three crops planted together on the same dirt mound would act in tandem to make each one work better. So this cultivation first began roughly 10,000 years ago with the first farming of squash. See, 10,000 years, a lot longer than 5,200. That timeline was important. And this system, which was originally developed by the Mayans of Mesoamerica, would migrate north and would become a staple for most civilizations in the whole region that could farm. In fact, it was so important that in the southwest, the group called the Tewa, even though they were in an arid landscape, still used the Three Sisters system. And in fact, bees were so important to the success of this system that they added a fourth sister called Rocky Mountain bee plant. This wasn't edible. It was solely added to attract more of the pollinators of the native bee species that helped the crops to flourish. So the squash and the beans that depended on this system of agriculture to be as successful as possible also depended on local bee populations. So with this vital system of agriculture that founded all of these societies, the people then clearly recognized how important bees were. Even if you could technically grow corn on its own, in an arid landscape, it made more sense to still plant it with its sisters and just try to attract more bees. Because on a per hectare basis, corn itself is actually more productive when planted with the Three Sisters. So, for many of these early societies, having enough wild native pollinators, of which the vast majority were bees, was hugely vital to our success as a species, even as we got into these civilized societies. I mean, just having enough wild space for your native species to live close enough to pollinate your crops could be the difference between prosperity and famine. And personally, I feel like we fall into this problematic mindset, and by we, I mean people that exhaust me. We fall into this problematic, combative mindset where we view agriculture and civilization as us decoupling from nature, where we stopped being animals wandering around in the woods and we became humans. But I hope that these examples show that that's not really true. And in fact, being willing to live near wild spaces isn't a threat, but it can actually literally bear fruit. It can be the difference in how we succeed, and understanding that and, benefiting from that relationship can have huge gains for you and your people. So go out, touch grass, and find a mutually beneficial relationship with something other than a problematic Discord mod. And with that, I'm going to end this off here as part 1, with part 2 focusing a little more on the history of bees leading up towards the modern day. Yeah, I decided to do a 2-parter. Basically, I decided halfway through doing this that if I didn't cut myself off at a reasonable time limit, this was going to turn into a 2-hour-long lecture of fun bee facts. I guess if that's something you want, let me know in the comments below. I will do it. But for now, we're leaving it here. So, like, comment, do all the things down below. You know what the system is at this point. And I'll see you next time.